Hello, Desert. In beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions. I have three tremendous guests today. They are regular guests. I'm sure you're familiar with them at this point. Jake, I'm not sure you've been on video before, but you've all heard Jake's dulcet tones in earlier episodes. And so, this is a little bit of an experiment. We're actually all in the same room together, but we're doing it as if this is remote. So there may be some audio hiccups. So I do apologize for that ahead of time. Anyway, I'm going to go around the room and introduce you to the crew here. Um, to my right, which the viewer or listener won't matter at all, is Jack Hendricks, my regular co-host. Jack is the vice president of the Politics and Leadership Club here at Arizona State University in the Center for American Institutions. And he has been my reliable co-host for a long time and our resident expert on South Dakota politics.
Yeah, thank you for having me back, Rob. It's always nice to be here, and it's especially nice to be here with Elise and Jake because then I don't have to talk as much. And as we all know, I really hate to talk. So thanks, Jake. Thanks, Elise, for subbing in.
And then another regular guest, she was on as so long ago as last week. This is Elise Johnson. She's now probably fully sleep recovered from her trip to Israel at this point. Elise, great to have you here. And lastly,
Thank you so
Jake
much. It's good to be here.
are the esteemed president of the Politics and Leadership Club.
Let's just say president of the Politics.
Apparently, he just took an ideology test, and and he found out that he's a quote stressed sideliner.
Yes, this is true. I think it connects back to the last podcast that we did with my perspective as an independent and a moderate and whatnot. I think it fits very well, and that's kind of the perspective that I'm going to be offering today.
And it's also worth mentioning, and I don't think I mentioned this, Elise, you are also vice president of the Politics and Leadership Club. So I have the whole executive with me today. It's also, I'm really excited for today's podcast. It's going to be a little more punditry than usual, and so this is great. And one of the things that's really amazing about this panel is I feel like I'm on CNN because I have we've got a Democrat at the table, we have a Republican at the table, and we have an independent at the table. And then we have me, the host. So this is great. We should get lots of different perspectives. And the intention today is after I make our great big giant huge, maybe the biggest announcement in history, certainly the biggest announcement in politics of the past history. We're gonna do another deep dive like Jack and I have done Jack did into South Dakota, and then Jack and I did into Maine and Texas. We're gonna do the same thing for Ohio, North Carolina, and maybe Michigan, if Elise will be so generous with us. Anyway, so without further ado, let me begin with the big giant announcement. We've hinted at this in previous episodes. Politics of the Past is launching perhaps the first ever, almost certainly the first ever midterm fantasy contest. It will be available for anybody to join. The idea is for political nuts like ourselves, this is your chance to play. It's like fantasy football, but for political nuts like ourselves. Anybody who wants to participate will fill out a roster of 4 gubernatorial candidates and 4 senatorial candidates. There are some rules about how you can make those selections. For instance, you cannot pick an incumbent. You also have to pick somebody who's facing a competitive primary. For every election that person wins, you will get 5 points. And the person who has the roster with the most points at the end of the day will win. What you'll win We're not sure yet. However, certainly bragging rights, maybe a big trophy, I don't know. But there will certainly be some prize at the end of the day. Anyway, we encourage everybody to join. It will be up on a website very shortly, in the next week or so, an opportunity to submit your ballots. Again, the key kind of constraints on you as you're picking your roster is you have to pick 4 gubernatorial candidates and 4 Senate candidates. They have to be in a competitive primary and they can't be an incumbent. The reason we do that is because incumbents tend to have a major advantage in these elections. And so if you were, if you really wanted to game the system, you just pick incumbents. So the idea is you can't pick an incumbent and you have to pick somebody facing a competitive primary. Okay. So that will be up soon. We're really excited to launch this. Hopefully we get people from across the country joining in. Certainly we'll get lots of people here at Arizona State to get involved. Should be a lot of fun. Really excited to see what happens with this contest in year of our Lord 2026, another American election year. Okay. So with that incredibly huge announcement out of the way, and hopefully everybody has a chance to take a deep breath and relax. I can only imagine how much how much their blood pressure is up now after such an announcement. So you know what, everyone, take a step back.
Well, I know Elise. I can see Elise. Elise's head has actually exploded. Many people know this. Elise had a head. It was on her shoulders, and it's not there anymore. It popped like a balloon, like a giant balloon, and it's not there. So fair warning. Like if you heard that and your head exploded, as Elise's head just exploded, we're not liable for any medical things you might need. If you need to go to the doctor and see a doctor and pay for that, that's not on us. That's on you. So Elise, we're not paying for that. And I just wanted to get that disclaimer in there.
So now that everybody's had a chance to calm down and can focus on the task at hand, um, let's do a deep dive into into 3 major states here. I admit I don't know anything that's really going on in Michigan, and so I'm gonna be entirely reliant on our resident Michigan expert, Elise Johnson's analysis as to what the political dynamics are that's going on in Michigan.
There are, I believe, 14 candidates. There's at least one independent, a lot of Republicans running in the primary, and a few Democrats. And Jocelyn Benson is pulling ahead for the Democrats, and then John James is currently pulling ahead for the Republicans in the primary. I do know one of the candidates. He helped my dad out when he ran for state representative in 2016. So I was kind of hoping that he would get it and pull ahead. He's a former Speaker of the House, but he is not currently. It's John James currently, which my concern would be as a Michigander. We have the Senate seat with John James, and so I believe it was Senate. Maybe it was House. I'm tripping because he's been in office for a while. But I feel like we need good people like him in Congress, and so while I appreciate that he's running for governor, I think he'd be a great governor. I'm also kind of concerned with the give and take with the House and Senate right now.
Okay, interesting. So, but the expectation is that John James is going to win the Republican primary for governor.
Yeah, so what it's looking like right now. He's ahead by quite a bit in the polls. So he ran in the earliest I remember him running is 2018, and he was running for, I believe, Senate over on the east side of the state by Detroit. He lost that election because we lost the midterms in Michigan. The Republicans lost the midterms in Michigan that year. But he's got a great military background, and he's got a really cool family, and so he lost that one initially, and then he did get in, and he's been pretty popular, I would say, at least in terms of Republicans. They really like him. And I also think that he's good, like, connecting with his community over on the east side. And so I'm thinking he would be a good governor. And I think
Lisa,
he
you
could
can
make
give
some
us a
good
little bit
changes.
of a quick maybe political geography lesson as far as Michigan goes. Where do Democratic votes tend to come from, and where are like what tend to be the more prominent Republican areas of the state?
Right. So Detroit is a big place where we get a lot of Democrat votes, and then I'd say Lansing is probably second, and maybe Lansing or Flint. And then Grand Rapids has also become a place where we see more Democrats. It used to be heavily Republican in Grand Rapids, and then we had some redistricting, and so that the demographics have been switching a bit with that. Um, but the rural areas definitely tend to be heavily Republican. I would say up north, some of those towns can lean a little blue. It just depends on who moved up there and who didn't. But yeah, definitely cities are, especially Detroit, is where we see most of the Democrat votes, and then towns and like villages and
Oh,
farmland is
okay.
Republican.
So if John James is to be the Republican nominee, what does he have to do to win the general election?
One thing I noticed when Trump won Michigan was that he got the vote in Dearborn. And as far as I know, I'm not extremely well versed in Dearborn politics, but I think they do tend to kind of vote as a block, at least in terms of the Trump election. And so I'm thinking if he can get the east side of the state, get Dearborn, he should have a pretty solid shot. Because the west side of the state, I would say probably leans a bit more conservative than the east side. So if he can get the east side, then I think he'll be good.
In order for John James to win, I mean, maybe any Republican candidate to win in Michigan, it depends on the ability to not only rally the rural vote, but it really, my guess, and maybe this is wrong, Elise, maybe you can help me with this. Like, I feel like if you were to run like a 50-50 election, like a candidate, if it was just like a generic Democrat versus a generic Republican in Michigan, that the Democrat would probably win by like 1 or 2 percentage points. Is that an accurate representation of the facts on the ground, or do you think, or am I wrong there?
No, I think that's pretty accurate because it's more of like, I hesitate to say like a family thing, but it's kind of like I was raised this, and then you kind of tend to stick with it. Like my family's pretty much always been conservative, and so we kind of just that's what we do. And I know other families that are like, hey, I'm historically a Democrat, so they usually just stick with it. And so I'd say if like we ran into going door to door for my dad, we'd go into a neighborhood and we'd knock on a door and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm a Democrat, but hey, you came to my door and you talked to me and you clearly care about me. Like, let's keep talking about this." And so I'd say it just depends on what he can do on the ground, and how many people he can talk to and interact with. Because if he runs a campaign that's more of less
Interesting.
personal, I
Okay.
feel like it'll be harder for
You
him to
mentioned
pull it off.
Jocelyn Benson is the likely Democratic nominee. Who's Jocelyn Benson?
Currently the Secretary of State. So I would say growing up and living when she was Secretary of State, I mostly just know her from walking into the Secretary of State's office and seeing her name on the wall. Um, and then obviously like she ran for it, so we saw the election and everything. But most people in Michigan, I'd say probably my age, just know, okay, Secretary of State, I see her whenever I go to the uh what's it called? Department of Transportation to get my driver's license.
Okay, and I heard what type?
She has name
How would you
recognition for
portray her as a Democrat? Like, is there a faction? Do you think that she comes from, or is there does she have a specific, like a unique backing in Michigan, for instance, or is she sort of the would she be Whitmer's preferred successor?
In terms of who's out there and who's running, I would say probably because she's been Secretary of State for a while, working alongside Whitmer for, I think, Whitmer's whole term.
So there are two things I want to highlight. One, Pete Buttigieg, who I guess is a resident of Michigan now. That happened quick. His full name is Peter Paul Montgomery Buttigieg, which I just learned mere moments ago. And I just wanted to mention that because that's delightful. Second of all, less important, certainly, than Pete Buttigieg's full name, is Mike Dugan, who is an independent in the governor's race, former Democrat, mayor of Detroit. I'm wondering, Elise, given that you have this former Democrat who's been endorsed by several statewide Democrats, and comes from Detroit and that power base of Democrats, how will that, do you think, influence the Michigan governor's race?
That's a really good point, Jack. I would say since he's from Detroit, he's gonna have like the home field advantage kind of. So a lot of people who are used to him being mayor over there and liked his leadership style, even if they're a Democrat, could actually choose him over Benson because she's kind of statewide. But if someone local's running, I would say like you'll tend to want them to win a bit more. And so I would say he could definitely take a significant amount away from Benson, at least in the Detroit area, which is where she would need to win a lot. And then with John James also being from the east side of the state, that could impact him a little bit.
And I guess if I would ask a question, as the stressed sideliner for Elise, why should we and the rest of the country be interested in what's happening in the Michigan midterms?
Well, Michigan's been kind of a swing state over the past few years, and so it very narrowly, I would say, leaned conservative in this election. Like it was close. A lot of people I know did not think that Trump was going to win Michigan. I did because I figured if he got Dearborn, he would win. But a lot of people did not see that coming, and so I don't want to. I hesitate to say it's like a Wisconsin or an Ohio, which a lot of my Ohio friends say. As Ohio goes, so goes the U.S. So, but I do think it's kind of a good indicator of how the next presidential election will go, depending on what happens in Michigan, because it's such a close state.
Interesting. Okay. That's that. I think that covers Michigan. I must admit we kind of we threw Elise to the wolves there, and I do feel badly for that. We didn't ask her to prepare. We just decided, you know what, you're here. Let's talk about Michigan, and so but we did do a little more homework for Ohio and North Carolina. So we should be, I think. But anyway, Elise, thank you very, very much. I learned I did learn a lot. I had no idea what was going on in Michigan. I grew up 3.5 hours from Michigan, but north of the border. So I've never had any idea what was going on in Michigan politics. So I thought Romney was still governor. Um, yeah, that's George Romney, people. Anyway, so but at least bringing up Ohio, that's I think a good opportunity for us to pivot to Ohio. Um, so there's two election, there's a Senate and a gubernatorial race going on in Ohio. Um, the Senate race is to replace a certain guy. People probably haven't heard of him, but he was a senator and then he became vice president, JD Vance. And his Senate seat, although he was only elected to it in 2022, there's a special Senate election for that. When Vance was elected vice president, Governor Mike DeWine, the Republican governor of Ohio, chose John Houston. Is it Huston? Houston? Everybody know?
It's Husted.
Husted to be the
It's
interim senator, and Husted is going to is basically I don't know that he's facing any competition in the Republican primary, but he is going to be the Republican nominee against a very prominent longtime Ohio Democratic longtime senator who longtime Senator Sherrod Brown. Now, Jack, do you want to give us an introduction to Sherrod?
Yeah, so Sherrod Brown had been a senator for many years. He initially got to the United States Senate by beating Mike DeWine, and who later became the governor of Ohio, had sort of a career resurgence. Sherrod Brown has long been allied with the labor part of the Democratic Party, with that more populist, more leftist part of the Democratic Party. And he's been an incredibly popular politician in Ohio, managing to stay in elected office in Ohio long past the time that Democrats generally became uncompetitive in Ohio elections. And he did that by closely allying with labor unions, closely allying with working people, which is a message that plays very well in various parts of Ohio. Um, and so he managed to be a progressive senator. He was not on the right wing or even in the center wing of the Democratic Party, and yet remain a senator from Ohio. He only narrowly lost to now Senator Bernie Moreno in this past election year in 2024 by about 5 points. And so, despite Donald Trump carrying Ohio by much more than that, Sherrod Brown ended up outperforming Kamala Harris in Ohio by about 7 points. Um, and so when you look at Democratic nominees for this Senate race, Sherrod Brown is far and away the strongest Democrat who could be running for the United States Senate in
Yeah.
Ohio.
So, is it Husted? Houston? Husted? Husted is facing a very formidable challenger to this seat. And it is interesting. I think that Sherrod Brown actually considered running for the governorship, running for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination, but then decided to run for the Senate seat here. Now, Elise, do we maybe we want to start with the Democratic with a little bit maybe more about Sherrod Brown here. Again, they're not really competitive primaries in either in Ohio. I think we know who the nominees are going to be. Um, but maybe it's worth doing a little bit more on Sherrod Brown. Elise, what what does the Republican Party of Ohio think of Sherrod Brown?
Well, one of my friends is an Ohio resident, and so I asked him for his take on, the US Senate race there and kind of what's going on. And so he said that Sherrod Brown is not like hated in Ohio. So he's not one of these people where, you put him up and it's like, oh, everybody hates him. So he's been relatively, I would say, successful in terms of his popularity there. And then um he also mentioned that he'll kind of side with the more Obama and Biden side of things, and Moreno's obviously very Trump aligned, and so he was thinking that, in terms of this race, if the Republican wins the governorship, then the Senate race will probably also go Republican.
I'm just going to jump in here and, as my historian prerogative for a moment, talk a little bit about the mechanics and the structural situation of Ohio state politics, going back at least to the probably to the Second World War. Ohio has historically leans Republican, though there have been periods of Democratic dominance. Um, the main theme of Ohio politics, going back to the 1960s, is its status as is its declining manufacturing base. It was one of the most powerful, or manufacturing was as strong in Ohio as it was in any state of the United States in the 1950s. But by 1969, that peaked. And from ever since, the probably the major economic problem that the government of Ohio has faced has been what to do about the declining manufacturing base. In 1958, there was a right to rule. There was an attempt by the Republican government there to bring in a right to work legislation. There's going to be a plebiscite on right to work. It was crushed by the Ohio electorate. However, in the wake of that legislation being crushed in the 1960s, you started to see manufacturing flee the state for states that were right to work, particularly in the South and in the West. And so again, ever since then, it's been the major structural problem that Ohioans have faced and Ohio governments have faced have been what to do about this. And Sherrod Brown is sort of a perfect encapsulation of that. Sherrod Brown argues for and sort of champions this notion of Ohio as this former uh, at its manufacturing zenith. He he very famously has said he'd never seen a free trade deal that he liked. Although he did vote for the USMCA in President Trump's first term, he voted for it very reluctantly, and he said that I think his argument was this is about as good a pro-labor free trade deal as we're ever going to get, so I'm going to vote for it. But even then he did so reluctantly. Has been probably as prominent a critic of neoliberalism in the United States Senate. Bernie Sanders is probably the more famous one, but Sherrod Brown would be number two, I would probably think. Um, so he very pro-labor, very anti-free trade. He has been a major critic of of tax cuts, of financial reforms that allow for companies to move money out of Ohio, move money out of states, that kind of thing, that allow for capital flight. He's been really the labor rights champion, I would say, in Ohio ever since. I mean, in a lot of ways, there's another Ohioan that he reminds me of, and that's Dennis Kucinich. Um, Dennis Kucinich was mayor of Cleveland until 1980, I think, and was in the House of Representatives for a very long time, and represented that laborite left wing faction. And then Sherrod Brown is sort of maybe the slightly younger version of Dennis Kucinich. And so what's interesting about Ohio is that there actually, I think, is general agreement on economics between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which is they tend to be um, anti-free trade, both parties. The Republicans less so than the Democrats historically in the state, but but by degrees. If you compare the Ohio Republican Party to a lot of other state level Republican parties, you would find that the Ohio Republican Party tends to be a little more anti-free trade than their peers across the board. So I think there is generally a bit of an agreement, and especially as Trump and Vance have taken control of the National Republican Party, you've definitely seen more of a merger there. So I don't think Sherrod Brown's economics are going to stand out hardly at all in this race, other than maybe by a scale, but by degrees rather than kind. Um, whereas Husted is, he's I think, kind of feels like a bit of an establishment Republican at this point. He's been around for a long time. Um, he the he was DeWine's lieutenant governor running mate. Um, Although that was sort of a compromise to unite the Republican Party, because there did seem to be a major division in the post-Kasich era between DeWine and Husted. However, they decided, there was some grand coalition during the 2018 gubernatorial primary where Husted became DeWine's running mate. And then DeWine nominated him for U.S. Senate when J.D. Vance went up to the White House. So, whereas before there has been, I think, some pretty significant schisms in the Ohio Republican Party, it does seem fairly united at this point. And Husted is not, um, he's a fairly establishment figure at this point. Um, Jack, how would you feel about that character?
I'd agree with that characterization. He's not a very exciting guy. Nobody's going to like really, really get jazzed to go out to the polls for John Husted. He's a reliable hand. And so when you look at the Ohio Senate race, he's the perfect candidate because he's not exciting. He's not, he doesn't arouse strong passions. He's not going to go and alienate all sorts of Republicans who will go out to vote for him because he's offended them in some way, or because there's, these very big ideological divisions or, various personality quirks that are going to alienate voters. He's a really good candidate. Just as Sherrod Brown is a very, very good candidate for Democrats to win that Ohio Senate race. John Husted is also a very strong candidate, and that's reflected in the polling. When you look at it, hasn't been that much polling that's happened in the Senate race, but when you look at the polling that has happened, most notably recently by Emerson College, it's neck and neck. This is a very, very, very competitive Senate race run by two very good, very qualified, perfect candidates for this state in these conditions. And so, what I think is going to be the real determinant in who ends up winning that race between Brown and Husted is going to come down to just how democratic the national environment in 2026 ends up being. And so the question becomes, yes, Sherrod Brown is a good candidate, but can he get the sort of boost that he needs from the national political atmosphere? Can he get the sort of boost that he needs from Democratic enthusiasm and from a sort of Republican malaise? And so that, I think, because both of these candidates are so strong, that's going to be the real question. Is Sherrod Brown going to be able to get that boost?
I mean, I think that definitely. I think that definitely plays a role. I mean, one of the problems, though, that I think Sherrod Brown faces, and he faced this in 2024 too, is that there's just less daylight between him and the Republicans on economic matters that there used to be.
See, I think I just See, I think I disagree with you on that. I think that it is not that there's less or that Sherrod Brown is moving towards the Republicans. I think the Republicans are moving to Sherrod Brown. And when you look at his continued success up until 2024 in Ohio's politics, it was because he was an economic maverick in the Republican Party, and the Republicans have come around to him. I do think he gets bonus points for being there first. And you're absolutely right. The fact that the Republican Party has moved away from neoliberalism and towards this, and we've talked about it before, towards almost a mercantilist economic model or a neo-mercantilist economic model. There is less daylight, and that does hurt Sherrod Brown. But I don't know if it hurts Sherrod Brown quite as much as you do, because I do think that he has credibility for having been there first and having championed that economic message for decades and very prominently.
I mean,
doing so
sure.
in Ohio politics.
I don't know that anybody gets credit for being there first anymore. Though that might be a nice notion. But the issue, my point is that he has a harder time distinguishing himself from the general from your general Republican voter in Ohio. And so it's going to come down to culture issues. And on that, Sherrod Brown is on the cultural left. And I don't necessarily know that your average Republican voter in statewide elections who keep showing in statewide Ohio elections have shown themselves particularly eager for that. Um, I mean, in a very long time. So I think those are the headwinds that he faces. He can't distinguish himself as strongly on economics as maybe he could have in the past. And that I do think that his economic message registered with many Ohio voters, but it not having that ability to do the same kind of he can't really distinguish himself as much anymore. And that is going to make sure that as an election fought on cultural issues. And I don't think that in 2026 Ohio, barring a huge momentum for the Democrat, that's going to help Sherrod Brown. Now, name recognition alone might get him there. Name recognition alone might get him there, but I'm not sure. Now, Elise, I want to move to you. Elise, what is your sense? How do the Republicans feel in Ohio right now?
From what I've heard, they feel like decently confident, but also like it's still going to be a really tough midterm because obviously, I mean, midterms are kind of the indication for the next presidential election, so it's extremely important. And um, I don't think it'll be easy because Vivek is the Republican gubernatorial candidate, but he's not exactly like everybody's favorite person. And so I'd say he's decently controversial. Not that he can't win, but that not everybody's going to be like, "Oh yay, I went and voted for Vivek." So I feel like if he has a hard time in the race, which I'm not sure because Amy Acton is his opponent on the Democratic side, and from what I've heard, they could have done a bit better picking a Democratic candidate. And apparently I heard that Sherrod Brown, they would have preferred Sherrod Brown, but he's obviously not running for governor. He's running for the Senate seat. Um, but if he had a more difficult, not difficult opponent, you know what I mean. You know, if he had a challenger who was a bit less Amy Acton, I feel like it would be a bit scarier for the Republicans. But I think due to her being the opposition, he's got a stronger chance. But if he struggles, I think also the other races below him will struggle, kind of the trickle down effect. So,
Do you mind if I jump in here for a moment, Rob? Um, I think that I appreciate you brought up Vivek Ramaswamy because he is what I think shows John Husted to be such a good candidate for the Senate race in that he's not controversial because Vivek Ramaswamy is the antithesis of that. He is an incredibly controversial, incredibly, boisterous, let's say, political figure who arouses strong passions, both in terms of those who like him, but especially in terms of those who don't like him. And that is proving, as the polling data is showing, to be a political liability for him. If you look at that, I mentioned previously the Emerson College poll about the Senate race that shows that to be a dead heat. Husted's winning that right now by about a point, but it's within the margin of error. In the governor's race, that is reversed. In that Emerson College poll, it's within the margin of error, but Amy Acton is ahead. And so when you look at, you previously talked about the deficiencies maybe of Amy Acton as a candidate. I think that Emerson College poll, both of those polls, both of the governor's race and the Senate race, more than anything, are really a testament to Vivek Ramaswamy not being the right candidate for that race and how they're not being the right candidate for Ohio in the present moment.
I would argue sponsored by somebody.
I would argue spoken by somebody, spoken by the analysis of that polling data. But you've got to. I think that more than anything else, it's not about Vivek Ramaswamy's politics, and it's not about John Husted's politics. It's about the fact that John Husted's kind of boring. And in Ohio, in Ohio, statewide races, as a Republican, you can win by being kind of boring, by, not screwing up and not falling down. The fundamentals help you along. And Vivek Ramaswamy and not being boring and arousing those strong passions is sort of challenging those fundamentals. It's an own goal on his part, I would say.
It's a good question. I'm going to answer it from my position here as the moderate, the independent. I've heard a lot of talk about, these boring candidates, the ones that maybe don't inspire as much enthusiasm. And to be completely honest, I'm very glad to hear that. As a moderate, I'm worried by all of these celebrities that are garnering for people's attention and kind of crawling over each other to get the most likes, the most views. And I don't think that that's a process that's conducive to producing good leaders and good governors. Ramaswamy is one such celebrity. He's very good at generating attention, at getting people to look at what he's doing, what he's saying. He seems to be decently well spoken, good on his feet. But I worry that that won't translate to actual stable governance, to compromising between opposing sides, to actually leading a very large body of people. It's a feature not just of Ohio, but of a lot of politics in America today, especially because primaries are democratically elected, that candidates have to appeal to the most enthusiastic people in their party that want to hear the exciting stuff, that want to be moved. But then once they actually win the primary, they have to go face everybody else. And everybody else includes not just the other side, but people like me that would prefer people a little bit more stable. So to summarize, I'm worried about this enthusiasm stuff. I like the boring candidates. I don't think Vivek Ramaswamy is one of the
That's why
boring
we have a
candidates.
stressed sideliner here, folks. Let me make my case for Vivek Ramaswamy in this race. Um, this is if you are not paying attention to the Ohio governor race right now, you are going to be paying attention this summer. This is the ultimate post-COVID redux election. We are dealing with two candidates who came to power or came to prominence by being on opposite sides of the COVID issue. Vivek Ramaswamy by being the candidate of anti-lockdown, for lack of a better word, freedom side of the COVID mandates, right? Amy Acton there were people like Amy Acton in almost every state, where she was one of the chief health advisors to Governor Mike DeWine. She was one of the chief advocates for more lockdowns. In fact, she even recommended that the Democratic primary in 2020 be postponed because of health concerns. Okay. She is the perfect target for Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek Ramaswamy came to prominence against people like Amy Acton. She is the perfect target for him. He is going to be able to remind Ohio voters about those lockdowns that Ohio voters didn't like. He's going to be able to, and maybe it was good for them, maybe it was bad. I don't know. But the fact is that it's going to be really hard to remind people of how scared they felt in May of 2020 or in April of 2020. And Amy Acton is going to have to be defending herself by saying, well, we didn't know much in April and May of 2020. Yes, I know that I was the face of a lot of those lockdown movements. Yes, I was the face of pro-science. Yes, I was the face, even if she was not particularly involved in trying to demonize people who didn't like for pro-lockdown politics, everybody's going to remember people like Fauci. She's going to have to she's the Fauci candidate in this race. Whether she likes it or not, she is the Fauci candidate. And Vivek Ramaswamy is going to be able to destroy her because barring a meltdown on some other issue. I really just think, I mean, listen, I don't live in Ohio. I don't know what's going on the ground in Ohio. I understand Vivek Ramaswamy's limitations as a candidate. He did come off as a celebrity candidate in the 2024 primary when he ridiculously ran for the presidential nomination, which was an insane idea. But Vivek Ramaswamy didn't understand anything about politics in 2022 when he made that decision. He had never been involved in politics. He didn't know anything about politics. I remember when he first came out and he started coming up with these insane ideas, which were the sort of things that I thought about when I was 11 years old and thinking about politics for the first time. I was like, perfectly normal things to say if you've never thought about politics before in your life. Okay. Um, but I thought, here's a smart guy. He's going to grow. He's going to learn things, right? He just shouldn't be running for president. I suspect he's learned some things. He's a different candidate today than he would have been 3 years ago. He has to be. And Amy Acton is an absolutely perfect. He is a perfectly calibrated candidate for Amy Acton. And people in Ohio are going to have to suffer through a full relitigation of COVID for in their 2026 gubernatorial election.
Can I offer a brief rebuttal to that? So I appreciate and I agree with you when you brought up baked-in narratives, specifically around COVID and Amy Acton and how she's seen, rightfully or wrongfully, as sort of the face of those COVID lockdowns. I think that the baked-in narrative also plays with Vivek Ramaswamy, though, where I absolutely agree with you that in a lab, Vivek Ramaswamy-esque individual is a perfect person to take on Amy Acton, is the perfect person to sort of lampoon that COVID history that she has. And I agree that because of that, she's not by any measure the strongest candidate the Democrats could have run for this race. And they would have been much better served by a Sherrod Brown or a Tim Ryan or somebody of that mold. However, when we talk about baked in narratives, you previously talked about Ramaswamy, running for president and saying things that were far out and saying things that were out there and saying things that didn't make sense. And he built this reputation amongst sort of folks like Jake, stressed sideliners, the people who are fundamentally going to decide this election. He built up this reputation as kind of a whack job. And so how much ever he has evolved as a candidate, I can't speak to that. I haven't been following his public messaging enough to speak to that or his, social media presence. But the fact is, there is a baked-in perception of Vivek Ramaswamy as kind of a whack job. And you might get away with that for Senate. We've talked on previous episodes of the podcast about how Senate elections have become more nationalized. But that's not as true for governor's races. Fundamentally, when people vote for governor, they want somebody who can pave the roads, and they want somebody who can manage disaster response, and they want somebody who can ensure things like economic development. And so states have time and again shown an inclination to vote against partisan interest for who is seen as the more competent candidate. You saw that in Kentucky, where Governor Matt Bevin was ousted. He was a Republican. He was ousted because he was, like Ramaswamy, seen as kind of a whack job, and replaced by Andy Beshear, who is seen as more competent. You saw it again in Kansas, where Chris Kobach, who is again seen as kind of a whack job in the Republican, was not elected governor of Kansas and was instead beat by Laura Kelly, the Democrat, who is seen as more competent. And so while I agree that the Democrats would have been better served by somebody who wasn't in that COVID response, and Ramaswamy is going to be able to make great hay out of that, I think that the baked-in narrative that Vivek Ramaswamy is kind of a whack job, as shown again and again in Kansas and in Kentucky,
All right, take a leaf.
that's, I think, going to do him in.
I would like to say something real quick. I think there's definitely a lot of merit to the idea that Ramaswamy can absolutely trash his opponent over the issue of COVID. I also think that there's something to be said that people are really tired of hearing about COVID. And if you were to ask me, I wouldn't want to relive it either. I'm definitely more on the side of Jack. I would rather hear less about lockdowns. We've argued about that as a country long enough. I would rather hear about how we're going to bring prices down, repair our infrastructure, do something about healthcare, education, all that stuff. And I think that while that may be a good strategy for Ramaswamy, it could also backfire and make him seem less like how Jack said, a competent administrator and more as a celebrity that's really looking for attention, which he might get, but we'll just have to see.
I would tend to agree more with Rob, and based on my friends in Ohio and the people I've talked to from there, they've literally told me multiple times Amy Acton was our Dr. Fauci. And so I think it comes down to how well Ohioans remember COVID on their own. Like, they can be reminded any number of times, but their personal experience with COVID and with the lockdowns and with the mandates and stuff will probably determine that. Because if you were a Democrat, but there was a specific part of like the lockdown or a mandate that you just flat out disagreed with and you got really annoyed with Amy Acton, I don't know that you'd vote for Ramaswamy, but maybe you don't vote for Amy Acton either. So I think this is similar in Michigan. Whitmer's race a few years ago came down to how well do Michiganders remember COVID and the things that happened during that. And it turned out that she won because a lot of us kind of forgot some of the rules and stuff that we were dissatisfied with and the nursing home incidents and stuff. But if Ohioans remember a lot about COVID, I think that could come back and bite her.
Yeah. I mean, Elise, thank you for your analysis. Brilliant. I love your assessment there. Wonderful. Jake, you're a problem. You know what? That's fine. No, I think uh no, I'm kidding, obviously. But I think, well, I think the reason that turned into kind of a heated discussion, which was good, is because again, I think that this election for the governor of Ohio is going to evoke that kind of a response. It is going to be this heated re-litigation of COVID. And whether people like it or not, it's gonna be the case that Amy Acton is gonna get dragged in and she's gonna have to defend her record. And, she's gonna do her best to pivot, and I hope for her sake that she does do a good job pivoting, away from it, but I just don't know that because she's never run for anything either. And that's part of the problem here is you have somebody who's a neophyte. She's not a neophyte, but she's never run in a political campaign like this before, and she's going to have to be able to say the thing that made me a household name in this state, you need to forget about. And that's going to be difficult. And now Vivek Ramaswamy is like the thing that made me a household name in this state. I'd like you to forget about, right? So this is going to be really, really interesting. And again, it's the long tail of COVID, whether we like it or not.
I absolutely.
I absolutely agree with what Rob said, except Jake, brilliant analysis, an esteemed president of the Politics and Leadership Club. Elise, this is your formal notice that we've initiated impeachment proceedings. But no, like I said earlier, Amy Acton is not the best candidate the Democrats could have gotten. The fact that Tim Ryan didn't end up running for governor for Democrats is ultimately a problem. And that's something that they really should have, in my analysis, tried harder to do, tried harder in that recruitment process. And so when you look at those Ohio races, I think it's really interesting that far and away the strongest Republican running in a premier statewide Ohio election, the strongest Democrat and the strongest Republican are both running for Senate, and the weaker Democrat and the weaker Republican are both running for governor. And if just one of those had been switched up, I think that if Sherrod Brown had run for governor or John Husted had run for governor and Vivek Ramaswamy had run for Senate, if just some of that had been switched up, I think you have a totally different Ohio lay of the land. And my analysis and my belief about who's going to eventually end up winning those races would probably be different. And so but it's incredibly interesting to me because you have such strong senatorial candidates on both sides and really pretty weak gubernatorial candidates on both sides.
Yeah, real quick, if I may. This seems to be, for all the Arizonans listening, very similar to our 2022 gubernatorial election. We had the Democrats running literally the Secretary of State, who is competent, not very exciting. I've seen her speak. She actually came into one of my high school classrooms when I was a senior. And if I'm being honest, wasn't impressed with her public speaking skills, but she was inoffensive. She didn't really have anything super controversial about her, and she was running against Carrie Lake, who was more controversial. She was more celebrity. She was, spent a lot of time on TV. She would say more controversial stuff in public. And ultimately, though it was very, very close, Katie Hobbs ended up winning the race. Obviously, Ohio isn't Arizona, but both being battleground states, it's interesting to see a very similar scenario playing out. And if we base it on what happened here in Arizona, it's really a matter of competent administrative power versus celebrity power. But I don't know who's going to come out on top in Ohio.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
Because
certainly how the Democrats are going to try to frame it in Ohio. Whether they succeed at that is hard to say. I mean, again, I think Katie Hobbs probably has a greater claim on having administrative experience than Amy Acton. But anyway, it's going to be it's going to be an interesting race. I do want to get to North Carolina though. We've tried to get to North Carolina for 2 episodes and we keep not being able to get to North Carolina. So I want to make sure we get there for the Tar Heel State. Okay. Want to make sure that we cover North Carolina politics and really we're not going to talk about the gubernatorial race. We're just going to talk about the Senate race. The Democratic primary for Senate is over for all intents and purposes. Roy Cooper, the current sitting Democratic governor of North Carolina, he's being turned out and he will be the Democratic nominee for the Senate. The Republican nominee there is a primary for the Republican Party. However, there is a candidate who has a massive lead in Michael Whatley. He has 2 competitors, Michelle Morrow and Don Brown. They're both pretty outside candidates, I would say. I don't think they're going to be able to really challenge Whatley. But for those who don't know, so Roy Cooper, by the way, if anybody is to ever write like political fiction about the United States and they wanted like a protagonist, like male candidate, like politician character, like there's like a 30% chance that character is going to be named Roy Cooper, right?
This guy looks like. And the guy looks like if you ever see a picture of Roy Cooper, he looks like the president. He looks like he's straight out of Central Casting. He's, distinguished and stentorian with, the nice white hair, and he looks official. The guy, between his name and his looks, might as well be the president of the United States.
Whatley, just to quickly touch on Whatley. Whatley has never held elected office. However, he was national RNC chair as recently as like 3 months ago. So he was co-chair with Lara Trump of the national RNC. He resigned that position in order to run for Senate in North Carolina. Although he's never held elected office, the guy's as establishment Republican as they come. He he was the chair of North Carolina Republican Party for a long time. He was the chief of staff to Senator Elizabeth Dole, for a very long time. Although he's never held elected office, and he kind of might sound a little Trumpian in a lot of ways. Don't let that confuse you. The guy has been an insider in Republican circles since the 1990s. And is as establishment as establishment comes. And so, we talked in Ohio about how you've got the Senate race in Ohio has 2 very, very qualified, I think, very professional candidates. We have that in North Carolina, assuming that Whatley wins the Republican primary. Although again, he's never run for any elected office before. He is a very professional candidate. His message discipline is outstanding against Roy Cooper, who has been a major figure in state politics since the early 80s. This is a kind of a battle of North Carolina titans, frankly, in the North Carolina Senate race. Elise, looked like you were furiously Googling a picture of Roy Cooper. What do you have to say?
I completely agree with Jack. He looks like he would be cast in the next movie about biopic about a president. He looks so much like a president.
Coming to you in season 8 of The West Wing.
One of the major problems that all
president of the United
States, they
States.
still really want to go back to the West Wing, is they still have this belief that the West Wing is like the West Wing's going to come back for another season. But yes, Roy Cooper does look like he could have inherited the role from Martin Sheen as president of the United States from the West Wing. Anyway, so there have been a couple of polls done here, and what they've shown. One poll showed something really remarkable, that Roy Cooper had a 24-point lead. over Michael Whatley. So it was quite a surprise. My sense is that's an outlier poll. I don't think that that's accurate. The other poll that's been done, which was done by a more progressive polling firm, shows Cooper with a 5-point lead. And I think that's probably more accurate. Um, I don't know that Cooper's ever lost an election in North Carolina, and Whatley's never run in an election in North Carolina. So this is really going to be interesting. Jack, what's your sense of how the Cooper campaign is framing Cooper's candidacy here?
Yeah, I think that the Cooper campaign is really framing their candidacy around Roy Cooper as a person. Roy Cooper is a North Carolina political brand. Roy Cooper is a guy who looks like the president and has the name of the president. Um, when you're Roy Cooper, when you've been in politics for 40 years, you get away with not having to define yourself in the way that, Michael Whatley has been in North Carolina politics, but he hasn't been on the ballot. He hasn't necessarily been on the public facing side of North Carolina politics. So he has to do a lot of work to define himself in the eyes of the electorate at large, which Roy Cooper just doesn't have to do. And so long as the Roy Cooper campaign continues running their campaign around their candidate, and their number one message strategy is our candidate is Roy Cooper. Yes, that Roy Cooper. They're able to really capitalize not only on their candidate's strength,
Yeah.
but on the opposing
One of the things
candidate's
that we
main
should probably
weakness.
discuss, I mean, although I think Whatley's going to win the primary, he does have to play defense on his right flank in the primary because of Brown and Morrow. And Brown and Morrow are definitely anti-establishment figures. Brown has written a bunch of, he's a former JAG officer. He's written a bunch of books, kind of fiction about not entirely fiction. He did actually write a recent one, a biography of a fighter pilot, but largely fiction about think kind of dime press Tom Clancy, I would say. The one that got him into trouble recently was about how there was, an Islamist infiltration of the JAG Corps or the chaplaincy corps. That's what it was, of the chaplaincy corps. And the heroic JAG officer was going to bring down this, Islamist cabal in the U.S. Military chaplaincy corps. And so and Michelle Morrow, who just lost in 2025, the state school superintendent race to a Democrat from Charlotte Mecklenburg. She's running for this. She got name recognition through that, but again, I think she's running. Their goal is to make this as kind of anti-establishment a campaign as possible. I don't think Whatley's going to have trouble winning this race, but he has to remain laser focused on Roy Cooper and not try to get dragged away by Michelle Morrow or Don Brown, who can do that. From what I can tell, I think that's right. I think Cooper's main liabilities in this race and I don't know that this is going to affect him in the 2026 cycle, but it might have affected him in an earlier cycle if he was on the Senate race, if he was on the Senate ballot, which is he was probably the largest North Carolina face on side of abolishing the trans bathroom law. That was a big issue in North Carolina back in 2015, 2016, led to Charlotte losing the NBA All-Star game that one year. And so, while I think that made him popular at the time when pro-business sentiment was still a dominant sentiment in the electorate, as it became more populist, I think that could hurt him. He also has, been he has kind of tried to stymie ICE in a few ways inside of North Carolina, various bills over the years. Which you have to do if you're a North Carolina Democrat. Like that's just a reality of your job as a North Carolina Democrat is you have to do that. What I've seen from the Whatley campaign is that they drag every time there's an illegal immigrant who commits some crime in North Carolina, it's sort of put up, you know, nail on the board, like put that up and say, this is Roy Cooper's fault. Right. And I mean, kudos to Michael Watley. His message discipline has been outstanding, which is and that has been the message again and again and again and again. And that just reflects a very professional campaign. He hasn't gotten distracted. So even though he's only down 6 points, or he might be down 4 to 6 points to Roy Cooper, he's proving himself to be a fairly able campaigner, even if he looks like the most socially awkward human being I've ever looked at in my entire life.
There is a there is a big distinction between the Democrat and Republican parties, not just in the policy platforms that they propose, but also in sort of, I mean, we've talked about Roy Cooper and his straight out of central casting quality, and then there's Michael Watley, um, who you can tell has spent most of his career in the back rooms on that sort of personal level. But I absolutely agree with you that Michael Watley, like it shows that he's a professional. It shows that he knows what he's doing. He's been here before. He's got experience. His message discipline is on point. He is a professional campaigner, and so he is the right kind of candidate. The North Carolina Republican Party wants to keep this interesting.
Thing at all. He hasn't felt the need to take a side on that, which again takes discipline in order to do that. Tom Tillis, the current North Carolina Republican senator who is retiring at the end of this session, which is what this Senate election is for, is to replace Tom Tillis. He's gotten himself, he and Trump have had several, very prominent disagreements, battles, whatever you want to call it. And Watley has very intelligently, I think, steered a middle course and not allowed himself to get dragged into discussing this. I mean, he'll discuss it, he'll mention it, but then he moves on very quickly. Again, just showing his message discipline and his professionalism. All right, Elise, Jake, I know you guys didn't have much of a chance to look into North Carolina politics. You've heard Jack and I debate furiously, or maybe not debate, analyze this. What's your sense? Elise, we'll start with you, and then we'll move to the stress sideliner.
I mean, this might be a little off the cuff, but I mean, ICE has been a big controversy in the US recently. And so I feel like if it's still a problem, like that's being talked about when this is all going down officially, I feel like that could have a problem for one side or the other. Because if they're tacking up all of these immigrant crimes and saying, oh, this is Roy Cooper's fault, and then it's all resolved, then maybe he's got a decent shot. But I don't know. In my opinion, that's like the biggest deal right now. So
Yeah, and just to add very, very briefly, I'm intrigued by what the Republican candidate has to do in terms of not treading too far into the Trump-Tillis break. I think that like an endorsement from Donald Trump or weighing into that field can be beneficial, but because of how tumultuous national politics have been as of late, I am interested to see how the Republican candidate navigates that. I don't have any conclusions to make, just to say that I'm intrigued, and I look forward to seeing how he handles that
To be
throughout the election.
clear, Donald Trump has endorsed Michael Watley for the seat, and I wouldn't surprise me if Tom Tillis has as well. Um, so he's far away. Like, he's helped both these guys raise boatloads of money. Okay, like he's part of the infrastructure that has won this state 3 times for Donald Trump. Right? Was it 3 times? Yeah, I think he won it all 3 times. He's won. He's part of the infrastructure that made sure that Tom Tillis won 2 consecutive. Both. Has served 12 years in the U.S. Senate. This guy is a bag man. Okay. Like he's a very, very, a lot of people owe their careers to Michael Whatley in North Carolina Republican politics. What's going to be interesting to me is that, and just Whatley's from Gastonia. Originally, for anybody who knows North Carolina, is from just west of Charlotte. It is the traditional Republican heartland of the state. Western North Carolina is about as Republican as any, is probably the most Republican place in the US South and has been since 1865. Um, that was the stronghold for that in East Tennessee were the strongholds of Republicans through the so-called Solid South Democratic era. Um, Obviously, the Republican Party has changed in a few different ways since then. But it has always been like, it has been a stronghold for Republicans in the state. And although there's been some softening of that, particularly around Asheville and around Boone, um, it's um, still a very, very strong Republican stronghold. Um, it is the part of the state that was most devastated by Hurricane Helene a couple of years ago. And Whatley was one of the guys charged with recovery there. And so this is one of the things that Cooper's hitting Whatley with is you didn't do a good enough job in Western North Carolina. And so that's all again, this is a very professional race of two guys who are very good at what they do and have been around a very, very long time. And currently Cooper's leading in the polls. And but Whatley's name recognition still might need to go up a little bit. And it's I think people consider it a toss up, but I don't know. Jack.
Yeah, my sort of final thoughts on the North Carolina Senate race is like my final thoughts on the Ohio Senate race. The national environment is going to play a pivotal role in this race. I think ultimately Roy Cooper has the edge, and Roy Cooper, like chips or like cards on the table, I think Roy Cooper's going to win. I think that his name recognition and decades of built up confidence and trust and experience with the North Carolina electorate, combined with the Democratic year that 2026 is shaping up to be, are going to give him the edge. That being said, as I said earlier, Michael Whatley is the right kind of candidate to keep this race close and to keep this race interesting and to keep Republicans in it. And so if Republicans have a chance, in this race, I think it's due to Michael Whatley and his message discipline.
Like we literally like press gang Jake into doing this podcast. He had no chance to prepare. So poor Jake, just press ganged into this thing like a poor sailor in like a bar somewhere like in the Caribbean, just going for a drink, and all of a sudden he doesn't realize it. Like the next morning, he's a member of His Majesty's Navy. And
It's a little known fact that actually most of the time what would happen to these press gang sailors in the Caribbean is they would have to talk about North Carolina politics. And even with the Royal Navy, they would have to talk about North Carolina politics starting at about 1500. So Jake is the next in a line of a long tradition of press ganged North Carolina political.
what's your sense on a race between two guys who are the way that we've laid it out? Even if you don't necessarily know the exact terrain right now of North Carolina, what would be your general stress sidelined perspective, longtime politics guy? What's your sense of what a race like this usually shapes up to be?
It's an interesting question. I don't have anything else to add on the subject of impressment. We can talk about that at a different podcast. Um, but for this race, I really don't know. It sounds like we have a very interesting slate of candidates. I'm intrigued by the fact that a former RNC chair is running for governor. And I'm also interested to see how people perceive that, whether or not Senate. Sorry, thank you for.
Rob is experiencing technical difficulties. So I want to thank you all for listening once again to the Politics in the Past Desert Dialogues podcast, brought to you, as always, by the Center for American Institutions. We will be back next Monday. Rob will be engaging in less punditry and more academia. So thank you for listening again, and have an excellent rest of your week.